All right, thank you so much for joining us. I am absolutely just rearing to go with this. This is one of my favorite panels from last year, and I am so glad that these women were able to make it today in their busy schedules. I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves and give them a little bit of background, and then we're going to dive right into the questions. There will be an opportunity. There has already been some fantastic conversation going on up front, but I want to make sure that everybody here has an opportunity to hear it. So I'm going to start with Ms. Deborah.
Thanks for being here. It's great to be here again. My name is Diane Russell. I'm the state representative for Munjoy Hill in downtown Portland, as well as the beautiful Casco Bay Islands. I'm currently running for state senate to represent a much bigger part of Portland. About 5 years ago, actually on April 20th, I put in a bill to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana. It has been a very interesting road since then, and I put it in long before Colorado or Washington State had done that. There was someone who showed up to the press conference with a sweatshirt that said "Jail Diane Russell." We've come a long way since then, and now we're in a position where the question of whether or not to legalize it and regulate it for adults and end this racist criminal justice system is right in front of us. In addition to that, we've been fighting to actually expand the medical marijuana program in ways that will benefit patients. And so I'm looking forward to having a conversation about what that looks like in the foreseeable future, and hope that you'll come join us.
Thank you. Good to see everyone. My name is Hillary Lister. I have a business, Maine Matters Research and Consulting, and do lobbying around medical cannabis. Was former director of medical marijuana caregivers of Maine, and originally got involved with legislation and seeing what a citizen activist could do in terms of improving the laws that we have in the state around medical use of cannabis, decriminalization, and hemp. In 2008, after friends both got raided and one of them ended up in the hospital and needing access to medical cannabis. And it's been a really good past several years working with people from a wide variety of backgrounds, people who are growers, people who are using this for their basic survival, lawmakers who really are getting educated about what we need to do to get policies in place that are going to keep people out of jail, make sure people can access good medicine safely and affordably, and working across party lines and across different groups that never would otherwise work together. We've really been able to achieve something that's the best in the country, and just want to keep talking with people about how we can continue that.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. I'm Deb Sanderson, Representative Deb Sanderson. I represent House District 88, which includes the towns of Chelsea, Whitefield, Jefferson, and the northern part of Noblesboro. But I do like to say that I represent the whole state, because every vote that we take, both Diane and I, affects everybody who lives within our borders. I got involved with medical marijuana back in the 125th legislature 6 years ago when we had this huge bill to amend Maine's medical marijuana law after the 2009 Citizens Initiative and what was done with that in the prior legislative session, and how that was essentially bastardized and changed around. So that was my first foray into the medical marijuana community and topic, and it has been quite an education. And I am thrilled to say that although I was guilty of the stigma associated with marijuana, I did not vote for it in 2009, that through this work and through meeting the people like Hillary and working with Diane and patients and caregivers and dispensary operators, I have become a huge 150% advocate of this program. And one of the big things that I really am trying to pay attention to, especially with being on the verge of legalization perhaps in November, is making sure, above all else, that we make sure we are very careful about preserving our medical marijuana program. We have the best in the nation, and I think it needs to stay that way, and I would hate to see what has happened in other states happen here in Maine.
Thank you so much, and we're going to just dovetail right off that. I would like each of you to speak a little bit about why. We often hear about how Maine has the best in the land, but for those who may be new to this entire process, and this may be their first experience today hearing about how it is that we have come to have the best in the land, can you share a little bit about why you feel that and what your role in that was?
So I think we have the best program in the country because we have had people at the table really negotiating on behalf of patients at every step of the way. This has really been a program that was built by the people. As Deb mentioned, the fact of the matter was that when the original referendum passed, the committee got involved in it, and it came to the floor with very little understanding of what was happening. And so the second session after that, there was a lot of folks that came to the table to help modify it, to help fix it. Some of the things that, as Representative Sanderson mentioned, that we were able to do, and she worked really, really hard on this, is to make sure that we got rid of the registry system. You know, we don't believe, and if you look in Illinois, Illinois requires fingerprints for their patients, and they're wondering why only 600 or 700 people have decided that they wanted to participate in the program in a state as big as Illinois. Well, because people don't want to be on a federal registry. They don't want people with the FBI and the feds knocking on their doors, and I think that it's time to get the patients off the battlefield, which is one of the fights that's been happening at the federal level, and we have to win that. For me, one of the issues that resonates with me, you know, we've done a lot to get this program to where it is, and also to protect it, but we also have a lot to do. You know, when you look at the qualifying conditions list, I just don't think that politicians should be in the middle of a doctor's office. You know, it's a novel concept, I know. I'm not a surgeon, I'm not a physician, Dr. Uma here is, and I am just not a medical provider. I should not be telling you what you can use medical marijuana for, and I should not be judging you based on that. That is just my fundamental belief, and I think the folks at the table share that. But we are in the middle of a heroin epidemic right now, and at the same time, we have folks who are advocating to continue the failed system of prohibition, who continue to fight whether or not we should have access to addiction treatment and add that to the qualifying conditions. Now, I recognize that the science has not yet kept up with what we're seeing on the ground. The science is starting to catch up. We're starting to see studies confirming the anecdotal evidence, but we are seeing people not only not getting on opiates because they are using alternatives like cannabis for pain management, but more importantly, we're also seeing people who are titrating their opiates down, and every time I talk to a patient, I hear a laundry list of the drugs that they got off of because medical cannabis helped save their lives. Now, I buried a friend of mine who was a veteran because the VA prescribed him opiates for post-traumatic stress disorder and alcoholism. Why anybody would prescribe opiates to someone who was already an alcoholic is beyond me. We know that PTSD works for veterans, that medical cannabis is working not for every veteran, but for some. And we need to make sure that the VA, and this is happening at the federal level, we have to make sure that the VA is allowing our veterans to have access to medical cannabis so that they do not get addicted to opiates, and so that I do not have to bury one of my closest friends at 32 years old. Story after story after story we are seeing across this state, and medical cannabis should be one of the solutions. So we've done a lot, and I'll let Hillary and Deb talk to what we've done to get the program to where it is, but I think our top priority should be making sure that opiate addiction should be added to the qualifying conditions. Frankly, I think the qualifying conditions should just go away, and when I introduced the bill, DHHS testified in support of that, but we were one vote shy in the Senate, and that's exactly why it's important to pay attention to who you're electing to office, because that one vote could have eliminated the qualifying conditions once and for all, and we need that extra vote in the Senate, and we need that support in the House to make sure that we have educated lawmakers fighting for a rational public policy that moves us forward, and I think opiate addiction should be at the top of that list.
Thank you, Diane. So yeah, just how Maine's law has developed to the point that it is and what some of the differences are. A lot of this came about just, I think Maine has been at the forefront for decades now. Maine was the third state to decriminalize possession and cultivation of cannabis, and you have less of a chance for going to prison and facing felony charges for cultivation or distribution in Maine than any other state. If that's all you're doing, you're just growing for personal use, especially one of the things that we lost after the 2009 Citizens Initiative, when the governor's task force changed it pretty dramatically, was the affirmative defense, which is something we've had in the law since 2002. It is a defense for if you are found in possession of more medicine or more plants than you're allowed by law, or if you don't have your doctor's recommendation, you still have a legal defense in court if that was for medical use. If that was for your medical use, you're growing your whole supply for the year, you're making concentrate, you're providing for a patient. And there's been a number of cases where charges have been dropped down from felonies or dropped entirely because of that defense. That's something that other states have had, but most of them, that's been pulled back. Other protections, as Diane mentioned, privacy protections. There is no registration for patients with the state. That's an issue between the patient and their doctor or nurse. Also for real medical access in places where people don't normally have access to cannabis and need it the most. In Maine, we have passed laws around access in hospice and nursing homes, saying that a facility can allow patients to have the medicine in a non-smokable form in their room as they need it to use it. With legislation just passed this year saying that the state will not take penalizing action against hospitals that allow medical use of cannabis in smokable forms. We're the first state in the country to get real legislation through around access for children who need cannabis to allow them to attend school. There's more and more children who are finding that their parents are finding this works for seizure disorder, for cancer treatment. And prior to this bill going through, most of them were having to homeschool since they couldn't access their medicine legally on school grounds. Year and a half, not this most recent, the legislative session before that, a small group of parents and doctors working together, there was no national backing or anything behind this, got through legislation that says a school cannot deny the child the right to attend school if they depend upon medical use of cannabis for their health, and that school districts must make a policy to make it so that the parent or caregiver can bring the medicine to their child in the school. That's been something that's major. Colorado passed a very restricted version of this bill. It's CBD only a patch, only certain conditions. This allows the children to have access to the medicine that is working for them for the condition that they need it. There's a lot more things that we've really achieved. I don't want to take up all that much time here, so I will pass this on to Deb.
Thank you. Both Diane and Hillary have gone through a whole laundry list of the wonderful things that I could have certainly spoken about. I was very pleased and honored to actually sponsor that bill for children going to school, and so thrilled that it passed. I think we have one of the best medical cannabis programs in the country because it is truly patient-based. It's all about caring for the patient, making sure the patient has the best medicine possible, making sure that we are continually looking for ways to create better access, easier access for individuals who would choose to use medical cannabis instead of streamlined, regular, everyday pharmaceuticals for their conditions. There still is a long way to go, but every year we seem to take a little further step forward. And I was actually pleased to see that with the work that I've done over the past 6 years in conjunction with Hillary and Diane on certain bills as well, is the education level of the legislators that we have at the State House has risen a tremendous amount. I'm going to use the school bill for an example. A couple of my colleagues on there have never, ever, ever voted in favor of any cannabis bill, ever. But because of the stories, because of the documentation, because of the real issues that were brought before, and the willingness on behalf of the parents and the school departments and this legislative panel to work together, these people agreed, yeah, this is something that we need to do. It's very difficult when you have a parent sitting in front of you whose child suffers from severe seizure disorders and they cannot go to school. And when they hear these stories, they see the faces, it becomes real to them. And so that's why I think we have the greatest law. We have the opportunity to make it even greater, is because those connections are being made, and it's through the advocacy of of the folks who are in the industry, the folks who use it as well. So.
Thank you so much, and I do want to kind of continue along that same vein. I think a lot of times people feel very disempowered and disenfranchised with dealing with large systems. And if you're saying that direct, connection, direct stories are one of the things that are really going to, for you as representatives, make it, kind of hit home and potentially change historical outlooks. I'm wondering, Hillary, if you could talk a little bit about, for those of the younger people that I see here today, what they may want to start looking at about ways and means to reach out in an appropriate manner. I think sometimes the passion and the vigor and the verve of the youth gets kind of bulldozed over. And then if you guys could speak to about what really does help you change your mind, what types of advocacy and activism. So.
Thank you, Janice. I think the biggest thing is just people being able to tell their personal stories, and especially with a small state like Maine, for the most part, the representatives really are there to represent their constituents, and if they hear a real personal story from someone who's living in their district, who this affects their lives, their families, it's going to have a lot more of an impact than necessarily lawmakers hear from lobbyists every day. They see them day in and day out from the industry. And you can spend all the money you want on a lobbyist, but when it comes down to it, it's really been the personal connections and personal stories that have gotten the law changed to the point that we have it now. For young people in particular, I just encourage getting to know who it is that's involved with this. You can do a lot of research online right now with the state sites, but if you can really get the in-person meetings, more and more activism seems to be going towards Facebook and social media, which is good for certain things, getting out at specific events, specific information, but for the real political engagement, it really is that face-to-face connection or that phone call with the legislator and talking to all of your friends and family about how this affects you, educating them. There's more and more kids I know who are educating their teachers in the schools about how this is affecting them, and with the stigma lifted, there's no longer the same sort of fear of if you talk about this, your family's going to get raided or something, and I feel like young people right now are being some of the best advocates for how this is a real medicine. And now that it's being treated as a medicine, it can be discussed. It's not just some drug that you might get when you're older and can find it somehow. It's a medicine that's working for their family, that may work for them. It's a plant, it's a medicinal herb. And again, with a state like Maine, medicinal medicine is something that really is recognized as a true form of healing and medicine, and I think being educated about it that way and talking to lawmakers about it that way really makes a big difference.
I'm going to jump in before everything good is said. That's good. I think it's really important for you folks to engage. As I mentioned earlier, my understanding and acceptance and then full-fledged support for this program for cannabis for medicinal use came through my interactions with the people. It didn't come from a book. It didn't come from Facebook. It came from sitting down, listening to you, hearing your stories. It's very compelling. After LD 1296 was passed in the 125th legislature, well, after we get it through the legislature, then you start the arduous work of drafting rules around that in order to implement the law. And we had public hearings on that, and it's really very, very moving and salty stuff. When you have a full-grown man standing before you at the podium talking about how he was addicted to opioids, and he used medical marijuana for another qualifying condition, chronic pain condition associated with the opioids, and how through that use of medical cannabis, he was able to stop using the opioids. He was addicted to it, and he was crying in front of us, and he was saying, I am now the man my wife married, I'm now the dad my kids used to know. Now that is really moving stuff, and it's those kind of personal stories and those kind of interactions that really lead us to understand exactly how important this is. Also, reaching out to your legislators, reaching out to your law enforcement, educating your communities on what you do. We have another senator who sat with us on the Health and Human Services Committee in the last session. He wasn't with us in this session, but he was anti-marijuana all the way until he was reached out to by a dispensary owner in his district, and he went and toured. He went and talked to them. He went and saw the operation. And he has done a 180-degree turnaround. He now supports medical marijuana and the program and what we're trying to do here. And I know I can always depend on him down at the other end of the hall in the Senate to support the initiatives that are so important to you. So it's that kind of engagement, that personal. Take a phone call. Don't call us and yell at us. We get yelled at a lot. Okay, we don't react well to yelling most of the time, but just say, hey, can we have a cup of coffee? Can I tell you my story? That's really what resonates with us, because we want to help people. That's why we're there. And but oftentimes we just need to be educated in all of the different issues. Set aside cannabis, any issue that ever has any is important to you. You know, make sure that you reach out to your legislator. You can find out who they are, get to know them. So that's really important.
Can we just take a moment to recognize that there are 4 women sitting here? I think it's amazing to have a panel filled with women. This is great. So, you know, I agree completely with what my colleagues here have said. You know, the stories make such a difference. But the thing is, we're in such an exciting time because the gloves are starting to be taken off and the handcuffs are starting to be taken off, literally and figuratively. The science is starting to come out with interesting data. I learn stuff every day that I didn't know, and folks come to me asking for information about cannabis and some of the science behind it. And if those of us that are sitting here who have been in the trenches for a long time fighting for destigmatizing and changing the laws appropriately, you know, I think the fact that the science is coming out gives us a remarkable opportunity to continue educating people. I hear from physicians that serve in the legislature, there's no science, there's no science, there's no science. And I keep putting study after study after study in front of them. I'm convinced they haven't read them yet, because if they did, they'd be really shocked. But they're not quite ready to cross that paradigm yet. But the more that the science comes out and the more that science confirms the anecdotal evidence that we are seeing, you know, like Representative Sanderson, when I first put in the bill to legalize, I just thought it was a terrible set of policies. Prohibition just doesn't work. But I really didn't believe in medical marijuana. I thought it was a step in the right direction. I was happy to support it, but it wasn't something that I really embraced in a real way until story after story after story, person after person after person kept coming up to me, and the same phrase just kept coming up over and over and over again. And I think everyone in this room knows what that phrase is. I got my life back. I got my life back. No other substance that I have come across has ever had that kind of power. Do I think it's a cure-all for everything? Probably not. But the fact of the matter is, it is changing lives every single day. And those stories are really important because they're moving people earlier on before the evidence starts coming back in terms of studies. But those studies are coming out, so keep studying the studies. Keep bringing those studies to lawmakers. And even the 3 of us, we're following it as quickly as we can, but the science is changing so rapidly that even people continue to bring me studies. And also, you know, I think it's important to research the history. I did not realize, and I don't know if many people in this room realize, that when cannabis was made illegal at the federal level, the American Medical Association lobbied extensively not to make cannabis illegal because of the medical benefit that they were already seeing. I have in my inbox, and I haven't had time to look at it, essentially not tinctures, but like recipes, medical recipes from medical companies that were cannabis recipes for how to treat different issues. It was in a medical supply book that someone inherited from their dad, who was a medical supply salesperson. He was flipping through and found all of these different recipes designed to make people feel better. So we have decades and probably millennia of history, but because we've been told for the past 8 decades that this is a bad substance, that it will make you crazy, the whole reefer madness propaganda, because of that, we have been denied the right to have that information. And I'm delighted to see the amount of studies that are coming out that are confirming what many people already knew. And every time that happens, coupled with a story, we're going to change a lawmaker's mind. And every time we change a lawmaker's mind, we change a law.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to a few questions. I know there was a gentleman in the green shirt. That microphone is live, or you can just yell really loud.
Sorry. Legislation going forward, we have a big November ahead of us, and I think the medical community is incredibly well represented here, and with you three who have all fought for medical rights going forward. But we almost have another fight coming up in November as to make sure that we don't get pushed aside with the big business that's going to move in with legalization. It's not that recreational legalization shouldn't happen, but with legislation happening so quickly and moving so quickly, what can the medical community do to make sure that the 2,000 plus caregivers that are operating in Maine get to keep operating, and that more caregivers aren't prevented from operating?
All right, I'm going to start down here one more.
Thank you for your question. It was a very good one. I am very cautious about the differences between the legalization effort and maintaining the medical marijuana effort too. Again, like I said earlier, I want to make sure that we're protecting our program because I do think it is the best and it serves so many people in the country, in the state. As far as keeping the caregivers that we have right now, I think we will continue to keep the caregivers we have right now. Once this law is passed, it is going to have to go in front of the legislature for implementation. And that is where, through that process, there'll be public hearings, there'll be rules, there'll be all kinds of opportunities for the caregivers and the community, both for legalization and medical, to be able to come together, have some public comment, work together. I would really urge everybody here to sit down, talk to each other, every camp, caregiver camp, dispensary camp, legalization camp, and make sure you're talking to each other. One thing that we have discovered, and I've seen starting to happen in the last 2.5 years, and I find it incredibly distressing, is, 6 years ago, I'll go back a little further, 6 years ago, when I had that huge bill in the 125th legislature that corrected what the previous legislature had done. It was a huge collaborative effort between caregivers and dispensaries. Everybody came to the table. We all locked arms, walked together, stood strong, and we corrected that law and made it much better and much stronger. The following year, again, we took a few more steps. What I've started to see in the last 2.5 years, and I find very disturbing, is it's becoming an us against them. Dispensaries against the caregivers. I want to say right now, stop it. Stop it. Everybody needs to work together. There is room for both. We could have probably passed some really good initiatives last year. But I stood firm and said no, and had enough people help me say no. Because what I could see one side trying to expand at the expense of the other. I want both sides to expand. I want both sides to grow, and I want both sides to be strong. And it's going to have to take that kind of collaborative effort between legalization, dispensaries, and caregivers to make sure that as we move forward, each side will have room to grow.
So if this does pass in November, there's going to be a number of various proposed changes to the law that wouldn't necessarily be addressed in the initiative as it's written, and we're going to have to be prepared for them. One of them we saw this session already. It was a bill to have a THC OUI blood standard. That's something that the Office of National Drug Control Policy has wanted any state that chooses to regulate marijuana like alcohol to similarly have a blood-based OUI standard. It's something that's really problematic because the amount of THC in a person's blood does not relate to a person's level of impairment. That's been shown in numerous studies from pretty mainstream groups, including the National Highway Transportation Safety Board. However, there is the federal pressure to do something if this goes into effect. I think we're going to continue to need to educate legislators, as we did this year, about the science behind it, especially when the impact on medical patients. When this bill was introduced, one of the suggestions was, well, some states have just suggested if you use medical cannabis at all, you shouldn't be driving, and that's not right. So that's stuff that we need to really make sure that patients are protected, that we don't put a standard in place that's going to cost money and end up basically targeting people who use it for medical use who never have below this blood-based standard of 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood, while at the same time not necessarily addressing the issue of if people are going to a retail marijuana store or social club trying something for the first time and getting on the road not knowing their limits, that there may truly be impairment issues. I think we already do have tools in place for law enforcement to deal with this. However, with the federal pressure to comply, if we are going to expand the access and expand sale to something like social clubs, we're really going to need to get our studies together, our science together, and show real clear alternatives to this. Similarly, I think just preparing for a different way of regulating and licensing, I have a hard time thinking that there's going to be 2 different regulatory models, one for medical, one for recreational. Every state that has passed this has done some consolidation because it's the same plant, and it's confusing to law enforcement to go one place and say, okay, that's legal for medical, that's not legal, that's legal for recreational. So really just making sure if this passes, and it has not passed, but if it does, that patient privacy, the right for patients to grow for themselves, and also the right for caregivers to continue to operate, because right now with caregivers, if you meet the qualifications, if you fill out the form, pay your check similar to being a registered plumber, so that sort of thing. It's not something where there's a limit. It's not something where there's a lottery where a large group of people and businesses are putting in applications and only a few are getting chosen. It's going to be really important to be involved in how this is implemented, because this will be the first time that the state will be looking at how much cannabis is under cultivation in relation to how much is being consumed and trying to match that up. I really have concerns about the canopy limit that's in this and what that will lead to in regulations that aren't needed and could create more problems. So I think it's just important to read what's being proposed now, know it can change quite dramatically, and no matter what way the vote goes in November, be involved, show up for the hearings, make sure your legislators know how this will affect you, what's important to you, and make sure patients can continue to grow for themselves, because that's been one thing that's really come under fire in every state, no matter whether they've gone recreational or not, that we're going to continue to need to really make sure lawmakers know is important, especially for a rural state like Maine, where people need to be able to produce their own medicine.
I completely agree with everything that's been said, and I do want to underscore what Representative Sanderson said. It is really frustrating in the legislature when you're trying to move things forward, and there's such a lack of trust on either side. And this side thinks that the other side's going to get the entire market, and then the other side thinks this side's going to get the entire market. And in the meantime, that fight has actually stalled increased access to patients, because people just can't sit down at the table and trust one another. And I think, when it's in the State House, folks work really hard to do that. But we need to make sure that, everybody should have an opportunity to engage who's already engaged currently. If you want to continue working just in the medical program, you're going to be allowed to do that. If you want to be able to engage in the adult use market, then you need to, look at some of the models that are happening across the country and prepare yourself to be able to participate that. And you have to also understand that there are some frameworks here that we have to fall in line with. One is the Cole memo, the Jim Cole memo from the Department of Justice. You really have to understand that Cole memo because we're going to have to be able to follow through with that. It outlines 8 guidelines that are largely about diversion to children, diversion to other states, preventing diversion of money to the black market, making sure that children are taken care of and protected, and I think that's something that we should all have a common goal about. We'll have to follow through, and it's a very important memo because it doesn't just say that you have to put laws on the books to do that. You actually have to implement those laws, and they have to be a tight regulatory scheme. That's how other states are moving forward under the federal government and being allowed to do it. So understand that from a baseline. There's no scenario where it gets regulated like a rosemary plant or a tomato. Because of the strict regulations that we have and the strict guidelines from the feds in this experiment that we're doing across the country. And at some point we will get to a place where we can have better regulations, but right now I'd like to stop putting people in jail, and I'd like to stop, rechannel our resources and bring some of that money in to build schools and not prisons, and to invest in substance abuse so that we can take care of our friends or neighbors who are dying of opioid addiction. That's a significant amount of revenue that can come in for legalization. But we have to work together. The other thing I would really say to your point, start having those conversations now. The industries need to sit down, and legalization has been held up in the state because of one word: market share. 95% of the bill that I have introduced has been supported on both sides, but what it comes down to is who has access to the market. And yes, your opponents, your competition, are going to have an increased access to the market, but so are you. We keep fighting over this tiny little piece of the pie. We have an opportunity to create a remarkably big pie and have the state benefit all across the state. I represent Portland, which has a pretty strong economy. I'd like to see my hometown of Bryant Pond have a strong economy. I'd like to see Washington County have a strong economy, and we have the opportunity to do that through legalization. But we need to be having a conversation now about what the market share could look like. And yes, if you give up a little, you're going to get a lot. And so don't just wait for the public hearings because a lot of the work's going to be done now. Sit down with the people that are at the table, and don't walk away from the table. Don't walk away from the table.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen in the camo. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to touch on what we've been speaking about. You see the rest of the country sees what we're bickering about, and it's not a good example for us or them. So we need to work together on that. My question is, as a veteran and as a Maine resident, what do you plan to do about the Second Amendment rights as a marijuana user? They're not going to come take my guns because I'm using marijuana medically, and I'll fight that tooth and nail to the end.
Thank you, sir. Nowhere is it written in the Constitution that you have the right to bear arms except if you use marijuana. You have the right to bear arms, period.
It says in federal law, that is a federal prohibition. As far as I've been aware, Maine law enforcement has not been enforcing against legal medical marijuana patients and caregivers for firearms ownership since 2009 at least. However, I worked with my representative, Larry Dunphy, on a bill last session around the questions about marijuana use on the concealed weapons application. That was something that was addressed through larger legislation eventually that removed the requirement that if you are carrying a concealed firearm that you must complete this application. However, that question is still on there. It's the federal level that's really the concern, federal background checks, and there is going to be a question on the referendum at November 8th about universal background checks required for personal transfer of any firearms, and that's where I think things could get very complicated for having a list of who's purchasing firearms and if someone is answering the questions honestly there that they use marijuana, then that could create a lot of complications, and I think it's going to be important to watch for that question on the ballot. But on the state level, I think we've really achieved about as much as you can, other than saying specifically that a medical marijuana patient can possess a firearm. It doesn't specify that. The Cole memo that Diane mentioned, that does require the states to take action to ensure that firearms are not used in the production or distribution of marijuana. So again, that's something we're really going to need to be vigilant on if this passes in November, that doesn't result in new restrictions on people being able to grow and possess and own a firearm.
I'm actually going to transfer this over to Dr. Uma. I'd love to let you continue, but they've got about 7 more minutes, and I want to get as many audience questions as possible.
Thank you, Diane, Hillary, and Deb. It's truly an honor to be here at this panel today. And a couple of things I just want to comment is, as a physician, we keep saying the word medical marijuana, but we don't seem to have the medical community on board yet. We have physicians that, you mentioned the AMA. Less than 10% of the medical schools are even teaching about the endocannabinoid system. And I keep saying it's over 600 million years old. We don't have a consistency of standardization. And I totally agree with you. I don't like politicians telling me how to practice medicine unless they have an MD behind their name. They should not be telling me how to practice medicine. And honestly, why should there be different guidelines? The doctor should be allowed to practice medicine and be able to make the diagnosis for the patient. A patient's cancer does not disappear because they go from Maine to Massachusetts or another state. A zip code should not dictate your care. And the other thing is, how can we help? My question is, we need it to be descheduled, not rescheduled, and I want to make that very clear to people what that really means, because it is now in Schedule 1, along with heroin, LSD, and ecstasy. As a physician today, I am not allowed to write a prescription for this medicine. I can only write a recommendation for it. It was allowed to be written as a prescription. Most physicians don't know this. Up until 1942, it was in the pharmacopoeia. And so you talk about research, there's lots of it, but I think it's time for us to speak out and speak the truth. So please let us know how we can help. Thank you all.
Thank you, Doctor. It was a pleasure to talk to you last night and meet you, and I'm glad you're here today. I find the medical community really quite fickle, depending on how you're approaching a given topic. When it comes to, I sit on the Health and Human Services Committee, so often the Maine Medical Association and physicians are in front of us. And one of the things that I often find is when we have something that we would like, a legislator brings a bill, a topic, anything that would direct a physician to do something, we get a flood of physicians and the medical association in before our committee saying, you cannot legislate medicine, you cannot legislate and tell us what to do. Leave it to the doctors. The doctors should be able to decide. Hey, I'm all on board with that. Absolutely. But what I do is I find it a bit ironic that when we had a bill to take away all of the qualifying conditions for the use of medical marijuana, and I actually had that in my very first bill back in the 125th. That piece got stripped out too, and then Diane Russell has attempted it since then. And then also with Lyme legislation that I sponsored and really had to fight very hard for, was to allow physicians to treat as they see fit. And the physicians came in and said, no, you can't tell physicians what. The medical association, the medical board would come in and say, no, we have these parameters, it's not by CDC guidelines. Well, so it's very fickle. You never know what they're going to come at you for.
As long as it's in Schedule 1 and people like their paychecks because they get their money from the federal government, folks. What part is it that we don't understand? It has to get out of Schedule 1.
That part I agree with. But as far as telling doctors, legislating the medicine, that's kind of the fickle walk that we will have to walk. It's a very narrow line, and if you try telling them, we want you to do this, then they have an uproar. if we tell them we want you to be able to decide for yourself, then the medical association comes in and says no. So it's very difficult. It's very hard to get some of these things through.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think there has been growing support, though small, within the medical community, but especially when legislation went through 2 years ago around allowing nurse practitioners to recommend medical use of cannabis. A lot of nurses really came out of the woodwork. It seems like in general, nurses have been more openly supportive of this than the doctors. I have a couple friends who've gone to medical school with the hope of this being something that they could really help with, and getting very discouraged with what the medical schools are teaching and not teaching, and really feeling like that's where the biggest indoctrination is happening, that marijuana is still this dangerous thing that's going to cause us carrying all these risks. And right now there really is a media campaign too to put out just these new scares of medical risks of that. So I'm hoping more of the young people getting involved might be able to get some change there, but I think change is slow with large institutions like that, and I just hope with more and more nurses and people doing this as personal taking care of family, that can help. And I know with some doctors, even right in Maine General, who did not believe in medical use of cannabis, through patients who have stood up and said, no, I'm going to use this treatment, and it's been documented. There's been a lot of medical professionals coming around seeing directly that it works, even if everything they learned in school told them, nope, the studies just aren't there. They're seeing directly it is working.
I concur. The one thing I would add is that when people think of medical cannabis, they think that someone's smoking a joint every single time. And what they don't understand, and lawmakers think that too, and some of the physicians seem to be advocating that must be, they're like, every time I talk about it, they're like, well, what about lung cancer? And I look at them and I'm like, well, I have never heard of anybody getting lung cancer from a brownie. I've never heard of anybody getting lung cancer from a lotion or a tincture. And the reality is that a lot of people don't understand that there are a variety of ways that you can actually dispense medical marijuana. They also get nervous about the THC. They don't understand that THC has to, in order for it to have the euphoric effects, it needs to be activated with heat, and it doesn't always mean, goes back to the OUI issue. So there's all these questions out there, and it just comes down to education. But the medical association has been very, very adamant that at any step of the way they have said absolutely not. We were trying to limit it down to, I think, autism and addiction and maybe one other qualifying condition, to add more qualifying conditions. And the more we narrowed it down, the more they dug their heels in. And it was really unfortunate, because I know a lot of people that would legitimately benefit and should not have to ask their provider for a recommendation for chronic pain when it's for autism, or when they should get it for chronic pain because they're suffering from addiction. That is an off-label indication that actually sends us in the wrong direction. We should not be forcing patients and physicians to have to make recommendations on, to work around the system. We should just set the system up to allow patients and physicians to have a rational conversation about something as basic as healthcare.
And we're going to be talking more about that tomorrow with the epilepsy and children's panel, as well as the opiate panel. In conclusion, thank you so much for your time. I would like to give you an opportunity, if there's something that's coming up that you want, people to know about, if there's a website or, educate, agitate, organize. Here's your pitch. I'll turn to Diane.
Thank you. I think it comes down to making sure that we get voices in both the House. Representative Sanderson and I are both in the House, and we have Senator Eric Brakey in the Senate, who's been a real champion. But we need more voices elected, and this is an election year. I'm running for state Senate. I hope that I'm going to win my primary in a week and a half. And I commit to continuing to fight for patients, and also to commit to fight for rational drug policy and drug reform, well beyond marijuana, making sure that we're approaching drug policy and addiction through a harm reduction model. But don't forget to get out and support candidates that support cannabis.
Definitely echo that on the elections coming up. Get involved. So many of these votes come down to 1 or 2 votes, especially in the Senate. There's at least a dozen primaries coming up. For primary elections are on June 14th, and there's at least a dozen I've identified where there's one really pro-cannabis candidate running against someone who's very anti-cannabis. and I'd be happy to give more information to people on those particular races. But getting involved with that, making sure you get out to vote in November, get other people out to vote, make people can file absentee ballot, make sure people who are in the military get a chance to vote in this. Just really finding any way for people to be involved in this process and have a voice in this process. Again, I'll emphasize, I don't think Facebook is necessarily the best way to do organizing, so I really encourage getting out to events in person, getting to know the people who are running for office, even if they don't necessarily have an opinion on cannabis, even if they're afraid of it, educating them about this, getting rid of the stigma, letting them know how this affects you in order your health, how you're making a living, and just personalizing it that way, I think is going to be the biggest thing, and paying attention after November, because again, whatever way the votes go, it's really going to be up to us to continue to stay on top of the legislators, let each other know what's happening if we're going to continue to have a voice in this.
Ultimately, the health and growth of this program is up to everybody who's attended here, because it's how you share your stories, it's how you conduct yourself, it's how you educate your friends, your neighbors, your family, your legislator, your local municipal offices, your state offices, your law enforcement on what you're doing. It's so important. There's this idea out there that cannabis is bad. People who grow cannabis are bad. They're trying to circumvent the law. And, that's not true. There may be very few that are little bad actors, but for the most part, I can't think of anybody who I have met in this industry that I don't like and fully respect. Absolutely. And as far as having the doctors in the medical community starting to be more aware of the benefits of cannabis, I think it's really sad, but true, that some of our littlest patients are the ones who are leading the way, especially those of our little ones who have seizure disorders. And when they see what the miraculous difference is between a child on a pharmaceutical and a child using cannabis can be, I think they're going to be our warriors in the beginning. They're in the ultimate end. I think they're going to be the ones who are really going to bring this program to the forefront when they see just how important it is that these children get this medicine. If they weren't, we never would have got that bill passed which allows children to use it in schools.
Thank you so much, ladies, for your time. You three are always my favorite living embodiment of the Tina Fey, which is get shit done. And thank you for getting it done. And please, take a minute, stop by, come, continue the conversation. We will be back with the lab panel at 2:15.
All right, homegrown, it is coming up on the 2 o'clock hour, which means science and extractions in the Penobscot room. At 2:15 at the front of the stage, we've got the lab panel, and we've got so much more. We've got Miss Erica Haywood bringing the music at 3:30. Stick around, get a snack. Come on, there's so many people to meet in your neighborhood.